The morning Everett Slade walked into the Millhaven Public Library. He was carrying a hat he didn't know what to do with, and looking for a chair that was as far from the desk as a man could get without being outside. He found one in the corner near the radiator, behind the periodical shelves, where the light came in low and sideways through a window that hadn't been properly cleaned since before the war. He sat down. He set his hat on his knee. He did not pick up a magazine. He did not look at the books. He looked at the floor and then at the window and then at nothing in particular. His name was Everett Slade. He ran a cattle operation 12 miles east of Millhaven, Montana, on land his father had homesteaded and his grandfather before that. He was 38 years old. He had no wife. He had no particular reason to be in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1951. And if you had asked him why he came, he would have told you he needed to get out of the weather. He would have been lying. Not maliciously. Just in the way that men who don't have the words for a thing will reach for the nearest explanation that fits, without requiring them to go any deeper. The real reason Everett Slade came to the Millhaven Public Library, that October, had nothing to do with the weather. It had to do with a woman who had been dead for 14 months. And a silence inside the ranch house that had gotten so heavy. He could feel it pressing on him when he woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't find his way back to sleep. His mother had died in August of the previous year. She had been the only person living within 20 miles who talked to him like a person and not like a hired hand or a piece of furniture. He hadn't known how much weight that carried until it was gone. He came back the following Tuesday, same chair. Same hat on the knee. Same hour, just before the after-school crowd arrived, and before the late afternoon teachers, who needed something for their lesson plans. He sat for 40 minutes and then drove home. I have spent a good portion of my life trying to understand what draws a solitary person to a place where other people gather, when that person has no intention of actually speaking to anyone. I think it has something to do with warmth. Not the physical kind, though the library radiator in October is no small thing, the other kind. The ambient warmth of being in a room where people are engaged with something they care about. A grieving man can sit at the edge of that warmth and feel something he cannot explain, and cannot produce on his own in a cold house with no one in it. That is what Everett Slade was doing in the corner of the Millhaven Public Library every Tuesday afternoon. Sitting at the edge of something warm and trying not to want it too much. He almost certainly would have kept doing it indefinitely, invisible and unremarked upon, except that the librarian noticed him. Her name was Frances Aldrich. She was 34 years old, unmarried, and possessed of the particular quality that made her excellent at her job and complicated everywhere else in her life. She paid attention, not occasionally, not when it suited her, always completely. The way some people can't help tracking the melody in a crowded room. Frances tracked people. What they reached for. What they put back. How long they stayed in one aisle before moving to another. What the set of their shoulders said that their faces didn't. She had come to Millhaven from Billings in 1946. Following the job and a brief engagement that had dissolved quietly and without much drama, which she considered one of the cleaner outcomes of that particular year. She had organized the library's entire card catalog system in her first 6 months, started a children's reading hour that was still running every Saturday morning, and quietly earned the trust of every farmer's wife within 30 miles who needed something to read through a Montana winter, and wasn't sure she was allowed to want that. Frances was good at her work. She was less good at the part of life that was supposed to happen after work. Because it turned out that the quality that made her excellent with people in a professional capacity, the paying of close, patient attention, made most people uneasy in a personal one. Men, in particular, found her unsettling. She looked at them too carefully. She remembered things they had said 3 conversations ago and connected them to things they said now. And they couldn't decide if they felt known or caught. She had made a quiet adjustment to this fact over the years. She did her work. She paid her attention where it was wanted and useful. She went home to her apartment above the hardware store and read until midnight. It was a good life. She had mostly stopped calling it lonely, and then Everett Slade sat down in the corner every Tuesday, and didn't touch a single book. She noticed him the first week because it was her job to notice. She noticed him the second week, because something about the pattern was unusual. A person sitting in a library without reading is either waiting for someone, killing time before an appointment, or doing something else entirely, and Frances had been watching people in libraries long enough to know the difference. Everett Slade was not waiting for anyone. He was not killing time. He was, Frances decided after the 3rd Tuesday, sitting with something. The way a man sits at a grave without knowing what to say. Presence without purpose. Being somewhere without knowing how to need it. She did not approach him. She did not ask if she could help him find something. She understood that a man who sits in the corner of a library without touching the books has not come for the books. And whatever he had come for, an inquiry from the librarian was not going to produce it. So Frances Aldrich did what she did best. She watched, carefully, without letting him know she watched. The way she read, without moving her lips, without any outward sign that anything was happening at all. The first thing she noticed was his hands. They were large hands, working hands, the knuckles thick and the skin weathered past the point where it would ever smooth out again. When he set his hat on his knee, he held it there with both hands, carefully, the way you hold something you're in the habit of taking care of. He was not a careless man, she could see that in 10 seconds. The second thing she noticed was that he always arrived exactly at 2 o'clock and left at exactly 20 minutes to 3. Not 40 minutes, not half an hour, 20 minutes to 3, every time, which meant he had somewhere he needed to be at 3, and was allowing himself 20 minutes to get there, which meant the timing of his visits was calculated. He was not drifting in randomly. He was choosing to be here and choosing the length of time he allowed himself. That told her something. A man who is truly directionless does not calculate. A man who calculates has a purpose, even if he cannot name it. The fourth Tuesday she left a book on the table near his chair before he arrived. Not on the chair, not with a note. On the end table that sat at the elbow of his usual chair, where it might simply have been left by the previous visitor or forgotten by a browser. She chose carefully. Not fiction. She suspected fiction would feel like an intrusion, like she was suggesting he needed to be somewhere else. She chose a thin volume of natural history, Montana geology, something that belonged to the land he came from, that wouldn't require him to go anywhere he hadn't already been. She watched from the reference desk as he came in, found his chair and saw the book. He looked at it. He looked around the room, not suspiciously, just the reflex of a private man registering something unexpected. He picked it up. He turned it over and read the back, and then slowly he opened it. He read for 35 minutes. He left at 20 minutes to 3 as usual. But he put the book back on the table with some care, aligning the spine with the edge of the surface. And Frances understood from that small gesture that he had been raised by someone who taught him to respect things that weren't his. The following Tuesday she left a different book, Ranching History of the High Plains, again with no note, again as though it had wandered there on its own. This time Everett arrived and found the book and stood with it in his hands for a moment longer before he sat down. He knew. He was not a slow man. He had understood by the second week that these books were not arriving by accident. He looked toward the reference desk, but Frances was in the back sorting returns and did not appear to notice him. He sat down. He read. It went on like this through November, a book each week, natural history, landscape. Once, a collection of photographs of Montana homesteads, which she chose because she suspected it might have something to do with why he had come to the library in the first place, and because sometimes the right image says the thing a person can't yet find in words. She was right. She discovered she was right 6 weeks later, in December, when she was reshuffling the periodical rack and found, tucked behind an issue of Life magazine, a folded piece of paper. Her name was on the outside, Frances, written carefully with some effort, the letters deliberate and slightly oversized the way they get when a person is writing more slowly than usual because they want to get it right. She opened it. There were 2 sentences. The book about the homesteads. That was my mother's place on page 41. I didn't know there was a picture of it anywhere. And beneath that in slightly smaller letters, as though he had run out of courage before he reached the end. I'm not sure why I keep coming here. I think you might know. Frances Aldrich sat down in the periodical chair and read those 2 sentences 3 times. She had spent 10 years believing that her habit of close attention was a gift that belonged inside the walls of this library and nowhere else. She had spent 10 years being quietly correct about that. She held the piece of paper and understood that she had been wrong. She had looked for the book deliberately. The photograph collection had 48 pages, and she had not chosen it randomly. She had chosen it because she knew from the county land records, which she kept current because half her patrons were farmers and ranchers who needed them, that the Slade homestead had been established in 1892, and would have been photographed during the federal agricultural surveys of the 1930s. She had known there was a chance his family's place was in that book. She had put it on the table because she thought it might reach him, where the other books hadn't quite reached him yet. She had been, without fully admitting it to herself, paying the kind of attention to Everett Slade that had nothing to do with her job. She took out a note card, the plain white kind she used for catalog entries, and wrote 4 words. I had a feeling. She tucked it behind the Life magazine where she had found his note. In the same place, because some conversations deserve to happen in the space where they begin. He found it the following Tuesday. She watched him go to the periodical rack with slightly less casualness than a man who is simply browsing. She watched him find the note card. She watched him read it and stand there for a moment with his hat in both hands, and his eyes on the middle distance. Then he sat down, and for the first time in 11 weeks of Tuesday afternoons, Everett Slade did not look at the floor. He looked at the books. I want to tell you about the Tuesday in January, because that is where the whole thing turned. It was cold in the way Montana gets cold in January. Not dramatically, just completely, the kind of cold that has settled in for the duration and stopped apologizing for itself. Everett came in at 2 o'clock as usual. He went to his chair. There was no book on the end table. He sat for a moment and then slowly he got up. He went to the shelves. Frances stayed at the desk. She did not help him. She watched out of the corner of her eye as this man who had sat in a corner for 3 months without touching a shelf walked slowly along the natural history section with one hand trailing lightly over the spines. He was reading the titles. Feeling his way, he pulled one out. Read the back. Put it back. Pulled out another. He brought 2 books to his chair. He read for 50 minutes. He left at 5 minutes to 3. The following week he arrived and went directly to the shelves. No chair, no corner. He browsed for 12 minutes, found what he was looking for, and then carried it to the desk. He set the books down in front of Frances Aldrich and said, in a voice that had clearly not been used much that week, "I'd like to get a card." Frances looked up at him. She had heard his voice exactly once before 3 months ago, when he had asked where the restroom was on his second visit. It had the sound of a man who talks to cattle and fence posts more than people. She said, "I'll need your name and address," he told her. Everett Slade, Rural Route 4. She wrote it down. She slid the card across the desk. He signed it slowly, the pen held with the same care he had given the hat, the same care he gave everything. She noticed his handwriting was better than she would have expected. Not elegant but deliberate. Someone had taught him. He picked up his books. He said, "The pictures in that homestead book, was that something you knew was in there when you left it?" Frances said, "I thought it might be." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "My mother is buried out there, on the property. I haven't been able to go out to the stone since she passed." Frances did not say she was sorry. She had learned long ago that sorry was what people said when they didn't know what else to do, and she almost always knew what else to do. She said, "The photograph was taken in 1936. There's a woman standing by the fence on the east side of the house. I thought she might have been someone you'd want to see." Everett Slade looked at her for a long moment. He said, "That was her." He picked up his books. He went to the door. He put on his hat, and then he turned around and came back to the desk. He said, "How did you know which property was mine?" "In the book." Frances said, "I looked at the land records." He said, "Why?" She held his gaze and said, "Because you came in here every Tuesday and sat in the corner and didn't touch anything, and I wanted to know what you were carrying." He stood at her desk for a long moment, this quiet, large-handed man with 11 weeks of Tuesday afternoons between them and nothing that had been said aloud until right now. He said, "I came here the first time because I didn't know where else to go. I thought it would feel stupid." It didn't. Frances said, "No, it doesn't." He nodded once, the way men like him nod when they have said more than they intended to, and are deciding whether to be embarrassed by it. He put his hand on the edge of her desk. Not reaching for her, nothing like that, just a brief contact with something solid, and then he left. Frances Aldrich sat at the reference desk for a while after that, looking at the name she had written on the library card, Everett Slade, Rural Route 4. The handwriting careful, the address 12 miles east. She had spent 10 years believing that the women who sat across the desk from her and said, with a kind of pitying affection, "Frances, you notice everything about everyone. How are you possibly still alone?" were asking the wrong question. She was beginning to think they might have been asking the right one. He came back every Tuesday. He checked out books, 2 or 3 at a time, natural history, then some history proper, then gradually over the late winter fiction. He always returned them on time. He always brought them back in the same condition he had taken them, which Frances noticed and appreciated the way she appreciated all things that told her who a person actually was when no one was checking. In March he lingered after returning his books. He stood at the desk and asked her about a book she had put on the display shelf near the front. A novel she had chosen herself that week, placed face out because she thought it deserved more readers. He had seen it coming in. They talked about it for 11 minutes. Frances knew it was 11 minutes, because the clock above the door was directly in her sight line, and she had registered the time when he started talking, and found herself registering it again when he stopped. Surprised that it had been that long. Surprised that it hadn't felt like any time at all. He came back the next Tuesday and they talked for 20 minutes. He had read the book. He had opinions about it that were direct and specific and occasionally wrong in interesting ways, and Frances told him so. And he listened without getting his back up, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She told him that. He said, "My mother didn't raise me to argue with someone who's read more than me." Frances said, "I'll take that as a compliment." He said it was meant as one. That was April. By May he was staying an hour. By June he was staying until closing, helping her stack the returns because she had mentioned once that Tuesday evenings ran long. He did it without asking if it was all right, the same way he apparently did everything, quietly, making himself useful, waiting to be told to stop rather than waiting to be invited to start. She never told him to stop. In July, a woman from the county reading committee came in on a Tuesday afternoon and found Everett Slade shelving returns in the back while Frances worked the desk, and the woman looked between the two of them with an expression Frances recognized as the town deciding something. The town could decide what it liked. There was an evening in August. The first-year anniversary of his mother's death, though he didn't say that. She calculated it herself from what she knew of the timeline. When he came in earlier than usual and sat in his old chair. The corner chair by the radiator. The one he hadn't sat in since January. He sat there for 20 minutes without speaking, and Frances let him. She brought him a cup of coffee from the back room without asking if he wanted it, because she knew he did, and set it on the end table where the books used to appear, and went back to her desk. He came to the desk before he left. He said, "A year ago today," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't know how you know these things." She said, "The same way you know when a fence line is off by 6 inches, you just look long enough." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Frances, would you have dinner with me on Saturday?" It was not a question the way he said it. It was the way a man who has been working up to something for 9 months finally says the thing he has been working up to. Flat and direct, because he has burned through all the preamble and what's left is just the thing itself. Frances said. He nodded. He put on his hat. He said, "I'll pick you up at 6. And he went out the door into the August evening, and Frances Aldrich stood at the reference desk of the Millhaven Public Library and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the specific lightness of a person who has been carefully, quietly, completely known by another person and has not been made to feel small by it. They married the following spring, in the Millhaven Methodist Church, on a Saturday in April when the mud had finally dried enough to drive the county roads without getting stuck. It was a small wedding. Frances kept working at the library. Everett drove in on Tuesdays to pick her up, and half the town developed the habit of finding something to do near the front window at 4:45 on Tuesday afternoons. She moved the library card, Everett Slade, Rural Route 4, signed in his careful, deliberate hand, to the back of her desk drawer, not because she needed to keep it, because she was the kind of person who kept the things that told her the true story of how something began. The first book she had left on the end table by his chair, the geology book she kept on the shelf in the ranch house. He read it again 2 winters later. He told her the section on the Beartooth Formation had something wrong in it. She told him he was probably right. He was pleased about that for longer than was strictly necessary. They had 31 years together. Everett died in the winter of 1983, and Frances stayed on at the ranch house for 8 more years, because she had learned from him how a person can be alone without being lonely, and because she had a great deal of reading left to do, and a shelf full of books he had brought home over the decade, annotated in the margins in his careful, oversized hand. She kept the library card in her desk drawer until the end. There is something I have always believed about the people who go through their lives paying close attention to the world around them. Not the dramatic kind of attention, not the watchful suspicion that is really just fear turned outward, but the patient, daily, ordinary kind. The kind that notices which book a man picks up and puts back. The kind that goes to the county land records on a Tuesday afternoon, just to know a thing about a person that might matter. I believe those people carry something rare, and often go their whole lives without finding another person who can bear to be the recipient of it. Because it is one thing to want to be noticed. It is another thing entirely to be noticed as thoroughly as Frances Aldrich noticed things and not to flinch from it. Not to feel caught or exposed or diminished. To feel instead warm. Everett Slade spent 38 years of his life without anyone who looked at him long enough to see past the surface, and then he walked into a library in October and sat in a corner, and a woman paid the kind of attention to him that most people go their whole lives never receiving. He did not flinch. He showed up every Tuesday and let himself be seen, slowly at his own pace, by a person who was patient enough to wait for him to be ready, and she who had spent a decade convinced that her way of seeing people was a thing that drove them off. She found the one person whose quiet, deliberate nature was built exactly for it, who could receive what she offered without wanting her to be less of it. What they built wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It started with a chair in a corner and a book left without explanation, and a folded note that said, "I think you might know," and it lasted 31 years. And that seems to me about as good as it gets. So I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever paid that kind of attention to you? The slow, patient, unhurried kind that doesn't need you to perform or explain. And if you've been that person for someone else, the one doing the noticing, has it ever been returned to you the way it was returned to Frances? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know.